Okay. Right. Okay, so welcome everybody to this meeting this evening. We're delighted to be joined by Sarah Firman, who's a specialist dietitian at the Adult Inherited Metabolic Diseases Centre at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And I think it's best that, Sarah, you introduce yourself from here. So I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak tonight, and to all of you that have joined on your Tuesday evening. As Jill mentioned, I'm a dietitian. I work in the Adult Inherited Metabolic Disease Service at Guy's and St Thomas's. So I am in the adult service. So the talk today is going to do a general overview of nutrition and familial chylomicronemia syndrome. I will be speaking from the sort of perspective of an adult dietitian looking after those who are 16 and older. If you've got any specific questions, if you are a parent or a carer of someone under 16, I hope you can still take away some useful messages from today, but I definitely encourage you to go back to your treating team and your dietitian to talk those through with them. But I hope there'll be something that everyone can take away from today. Yeah, perfect. So in terms of the outline for the evening, so we've got an hour and a half this evening, and I'm going to be spending some time talking over the overview of dietary recommendations for FCS, a little bit around suggestions around structures of meal and how your plate could maybe look with considering the diet, talking around how much fat is in that, so using food labels to guide on working out how much fat would be in certain products, talking through tips on cooking without fat, eating out, and also monitoring, so how much fat am I having each day. I'll also talk a bit around FCS and diabetes, and also around hospital admissions. And at the end, there will be some time, hopefully, for some questions and answers. So as Jill mentioned at the start, happy for you to put any questions that you have throughout the talk in the chat, and we can talk through those at the end. So Jill really kindly in advance sent me some topics or areas to cover. So I hope I cover those today and answer any questions that you have or provide any guidance. But again, if something isn't answered, welcome to put in the questions and answers. And if we don't have time at the end, then I'm happy to answer that question at a later point and pass that back on to Jill to share with yourselves. So just to start off, the dietary recommendations for FCS. So the overall arching principle of the diet is a very low-fat diet. And the very low-fat diet's aim is to try and reduce triglyceride levels to less than 10 millimoles per litre. And by doing so, reduce the risk of pancreatitis. So as we know with FCS, there is an increase in triglyceride levels in the blood. And it results from a deficiency, either from a deficiency in the enzyme lipoprotein lipase, or a inability for other proteins that are useful for LPL function to be able to function correctly. So there's two aspects or two reasons why triglycerides might not able to be metabolized properly and therefore build up in the blood and in the body to high levels, which does put someone at increased risk of acute pancreatitis. So the goal is, at the moment, the mainstay of treatment is a very low-fat diet. And the diet tends to be less than 20 grams or around 20 grams a day, but it really does depend on the individual. So it varies from person to person. And it is determined by someone's triglyceride levels. So monitoring triglyceride levels and adjusting the diet to support bringing those triglyceride levels to as close as possible to 10. It might not always be realistic to aim to get below 10 millimoles per litre, but for aiming for that level to come down as much as possible. And of course, reduce the risk of any stomach pains and acute pancreatitis. Whenever I think of, so there's a few different conditions that we look after or support in the metabolic service, and different ones have different macronutrients, so either fats, proteins, or carbohydrates that the body can't metabolize well. And so in this case with FCS, it's the fat. And I always like to think of what is the role of fat, and therefore what factors do we need to consider when supporting the diet, to make sure that it is optimal. So fat has a role in providing essential fatty acids, and essential fatty acids are fats that the body can't make, so they can only come from the diet, and they do have some important roles, and we'll talk about that shortly. Fat also has a role in providing fat-soluble vitamins, so vitamins can either be water-soluble or fat-soluble, and a lot of our fat-soluble vitamins are found in foods that are slightly higher in fat, but fat also has a role in helping to absorb fat-soluble vitamins into the body. Fats play a really important role in satiety and that feeling of fullness, feeling of not having, feeling that a meal has satisfied you and not having cravings. And fats are really important for calories, and calories are being the fuel for the body to help with growth and development and also weight. So some of the potential challenges that could happen with a very low fat diet is not getting enough essential fatty acids. So that's something that is important to monitor. Not getting enough of the fat soluble vitamins, potentially struggling with feeling full or satisfied with meals because that fat aspect is not a big part of the meal, and potentially for some struggling to get enough calories, and that could then for some lead to struggling to keep weight on or maybe experiencing weight loss. So these are some of the factors that I'm going to talk through as we go through the presentation. To start with, I was going to talk briefly about essential fatty acids, and you might recognize the names of omega-3 and omega-6. So they're the two essential fatty acids that our body can't make, so they have to come from the diet. And essential fatty acids have an important role. They're important in the brain, the eye, they're a part of all cells of our body, and they also have an important role in inflammation. So omega-3 and omega-6 normally are found in vegetable oils, seeds, nuts, oily fish, whole grains, chicken, eggs, and some leafy green vegetables. And as you'll know, some of those foods aren't going to be part of a very low fat diet. So it is important for these to be monitored, and for your dietitian to work with you to make sure that you are getting a source of essential fatty acids. Your intake of essential fatty acids will depend on your fat restriction. So someone who's got a very, very strict fat restrictions, say for example 10 grams, 15 grams, might not get as much essential fatty acids from their diet and food choices as someone on a slightly higher fat restriction. And it also depends on food choices themselves. So whole grains or wholemeal bread, for example, will have more essential fatty acids than white bread. And we will talk a bit more about that when we get to the carbohydrates. The essential fatty acids, the omega-3 and the omega-6, they convert through to longer chain fats, which also have important roles for health. So there are ways that these can be monitored. Blood tests aren't always easily available, but if you are deficient in essential fatty acids, some people can experience dry hair, skin, brittle nails, even sometimes little bumps that can raise up on the skin. So it's important to, if you're noticing any of these or are on a very low fat diet, to link in with your dietitian to discuss ensuring you've got enough sources of omega-3 and omega-6. The other aspect is the fat-soluble vitamins. So the fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin A, D, E, and K. And the fat-soluble vitamins have a role in keeping eyes, bones, skin, hair healthy, and also a role in blood clotting, immune function, and antioxidants. So as I mentioned previously, fat-soluble vitamins do sometimes come from high-fat foods. They can also come from other sources. Vitamin D comes from sunshine. So during our summer months, or if you do obviously not at the moment is as easy, but if getting abroad, getting some nice sunshine can help with vitamin D. But during winter, everyone tends to experience low vitamin D. So it's important for all of these vitamins to be monitored by your treating team, and you may require a supplement just to top up the levels of the fat-soluble vitamins. Now we have talked, or I've mentioned about, and as you know well, the fat aspect of the diet and limiting that. It's also important to consider what other components make up the diet. And one of those components is protein. So protein plays a really important role in helping with satiety, which normally fat also plays a role in, but with limiting it, protein can help to give you that feeling of fullness. It's also important in muscle maintenance and growth. And protein has a really important role in supporting growth and development. So for children growing into adulthood and throughout life. And it also provides a source of calories for the body. But not all proteins are low in fat. So it is about picking the ones that give you the benefits of the protein, but aren't contributing large amounts of fat to the diet. So some examples of these lean fat, low fat or lean proteins could be turkey or chicken breast. There are some other lean cuts of meat, such as low fat hams or goat. Egg whites are a good source, a low fat source of protein, as most of the fat is in the yolk. And seafood, tin tuna that's in spring water or brine is a good option, avoiding those that are in oil. Whitefish, prawns, and then you've got the legumes. The pulses are also another really good source of protein, good source of fiber that are lower in fat. And then the fat-free dairy are another option. Fat-free dairy is helpful for providing other vitamins, minerals, such as calcium, but it also is a good source of protein, and there are some fat-free options that are available, such as the cottage cheese, fat-free quark, fat-free yogurt, and skimmed milk. So how does protein factor into your structure of your meal or your plate? So some people talk about, when they're thinking about components on a plate, that protein should make up about a third of your plate. And within that third of your plate, you might have some protein from animal sources, such as a chicken breast or white fish. And you might also have a dairy component, such as low-fat, fat-free yogurt. Others like to talk about protein in terms of the hand. So your hand is a really good guide because it fits generally to the size of your body and what your body needs. So when it comes to protein, a good guide is to aim for at least a palm, if not a hand for some. So if you're talking about fish, aiming for your hand size piece of protein at each meal. Other proteins, at least a palm, if not slightly above, to give you your protein needs, but also to help with satiety and provide a source of calories. The other aspect of the diet is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are the starchy foods. They're things such as your bread, rice, pasta, and they also play a really important role in satiety. So they can help with giving you a sense of feeling full. Carbohydrates are also broken down in the body to glucose, which is the main source of fuel for your body. So they are the main fuel that your brain uses and also your body, really important for day-to-day functioning. And they do also provide a good source of calories and can provide a good source of fiber. For example, potato with the skin on is a good source of fiber, or wholemeal bread. So the advice for FCS is to try as much as possible to aim for complex carbohydrates. And when we talk about complex carbohydrates, so there's either refined or complex. So refined carbohydrates are those that are very quickly absorbed into the body. So they have a very quick rise in blood sugars. They can cause your blood glucose to rise, and then sometimes can follow with quite a drop, where a complex carbohydrate has a much slower release in the body, a slower breakdown, and so the glucose or the sugar rise in your body is much more gradual and lasts for longer. So they're a more prolonged or longer source of fuel. Refined carbohydrates are things such as white flour, white rice, white breads, where complex are more of your whole grains, brown rice, wholemeal flour. It is a bit of a balancing act though, because if you have looked on labels of different products, generally the complex carbohydrates, the ones that are more whole grain or brown rice, tend to be slightly higher in fat than the more refined carbohydrates. So it is a bit of a balance, and it could be that even having half-half could be a good starting point, but they do factor into your fat allowance. So working with your dietitian, seeing how you can incorporate some more complex carbohydrates could be useful. It also really becomes important when we talk a bit further on about diabetes, if that is also part of the management as well. The balancing act also comes into play when manufacturers, when they reduce the fat of products, sometimes they like to add in more sugar, which doesn't help. So one of the aspects of a FCS diet is to try and avoid added sugar where possible. So looking at, for example, some low-fat yogurts sometimes can be high in sugar. So reading the label and just getting familiar with what's in the product. Some foods may also be high in natural sugars, so such as fruit or fruit juice. Now, these are both still very important parts of the diet. They do provide lots of vitamins and minerals, but the amount can be important. So not having excessive amounts of fruit juices or large frequent portions of fruit throughout the day, because that can sometimes impact on overall sugar intake. So it's just about having a balance with that. And again, we'll talk about that shortly with regards to your plate. But carbohydrates are a really important source of calories. So it is important to incorporate them at each meal, as they do have lots of benefits. So some examples of carbohydrates could be a jacket potato, sweet potato, brown rice, white rice, bulgur wheat, couscous, pasta, the breads, wholemeal bread, chapati, oats, so talking about cereals, Weetabix, shredded wheats. So I've included a variety of different carbohydrates there, and the key is to always include carbohydrates in meal because they're important fuel. And the next aspect is working with dietitian or looking at recipes that maybe do use a little bit more of the complex carbohydrates as well, and factoring that in. So when it comes to your plate, the recommendation is for carbohydrates to also make up a third of your plate. So we've got a third from protein and a third from carbohydrates. And when it comes to using your hands as a guide for the model, your fist can be a really good portion. So to aim for at least your carbohydrates to be the fist, sometimes maybe a fist and a half, to get that that third of a plate of carbohydrates. Having large amounts of carbohydrates can push up your triglycerides. So we do recommend to try and keep it down to that round about that fist to a fist and a half a day. Now I've just included this slide, and I know it's a little bit confusing as I've just spoken about the plate model. So these are pie charts, and they don't necessarily translate to the plate, but it's just to have a look at how a low-fat, very low-fat diet might compare to the general population recommendation. So for the general population, there is recommendations on how much of your calories should come, so your fuel should come from fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. So fats, you might be aiming to get around about 20 to 35% of your calories from fats, protein 10 to 35%, and carbohydrates around 45 to 65% of your calories. So that's for the general population. Whereas on a very low fat diet, fat needs to be restricted to around about, now it does vary from person to person, but around about 10% of your calories, 10 to 15% of your calories might come from fats. So as you can see, there's a large portion then of your fuel for the day that needs to come from protein and carbohydrates. So they are really important players in your overall fuel for the day, and thinking about what sources of protein would be lean or low fat to incorporate or include, and what sources of carbohydrates would be good to include in the day. Now, there is another aspect to where your calories can come from, and that is the role of medium chain triglycerides. So medium chain triglycerides are absorbed a different way in the body, so they bypass the chylomicron dependent pathway. Therefore, they don't cause a big increase in chylomicrons and triglycerides in the body. So they go via a different vein to the liver. And MCT, or medium chain triglycerides, therefore can be a useful option to provide calories if someone is struggling to meet calories, which are obviously really important for growth during childhood, adolescence, and also if you're struggling to maintain weight. They can also be used if your amount of carbohydrates that you're needing to take to get your calories for the day is quite large, and we're needing to maybe look at how we could bring that down slightly. So we're needing to get calories from something else. And that's where MCT can play an important role. It is important though that the MCT oil is medical grade. So you can sometimes see MCT oils available online or over the counter. Sometimes you might hear that coconut oil could be used. Those all unfortunately still contain some of the longer chain fats, which will put up triglycerides. So it's important for them to be specifically medical grade MCT, so that we know that they just contain the MCT oil. So you can talk to your dietitian or to your treating physician, doctor, about the option of this if you feel that that would be useful. And they could look and explore into the options that are available. I know we've got people calling in from different parts of the world. So talking with your treating team to see what's available in your country. MCT oil can sometimes have some intolerances, so can sometimes cause bloating or some stomach problems. And so it is important to increase it very gradually, just to test your tolerance. It is also an oil that has a very low smoke point, so it isn't very helpful. You can't fry with it or do high cooking or cooking at high temperatures, but it can be useful for low temperature cooking or to add to foods after they've been cooked. So coming back to the plate, and where do our foods fit? So we've got a third of the plate from proteins. We've got a third of the plate coming from carbohydrates. And now we've got 1/3 left, and where that might come from is the role of vegetables. So vegetables also play a very important role in the diet. One, they provide a lot of color, which is great, but they also help with that feeling of fullness because they are high in fiber. They provide a good source of vitamins and minerals. And in general, most vegetables are low fat. There's a couple to be wary of, and they sort of sometimes fit in the fat, or I'm sorry, in the fruit or the vegetable area, but those are foods such as olives, avocado, coconut, and also some vegetables might be in oil. So for example, sun-dried tomatoes in oil, that would be very high in fat. But plain, tomatoes as they come fresh or cooked with are a low-fat option. So vegetables therefore make up the last third of the plate and are an important component. And your fist can also be a good guide for vegetables. So again, at least a fist, ideally two, to fill up that plate. And then the last aspect is the fruit. And fruit also has a source of fiber, vitamins and minerals. So we do recommend including up to 2 serves of fruit a day, and a good portion, again using your hand, a portion of fruit is what would fit in your hand. So aiming for about 2 portions a day to give you vitamins and minerals and variety in the diet as well. And the last few dietary recommendations is around avoiding alcohol. So if alcohol itself does increase triglycerides, and so consuming alcohol with FCS does put you at increased risk of triglycerides increasing and increased risk of pancreatitis. So we do recommend to consider alcohol-free options, such as an alcohol-free beverage or a sugar-free drink option. And the other aspect of the diet is around regular exercise. So this isn't specific to FCS. Regular exercise is important for overall health, maintaining muscle. And the recommendation for adults is to aim for at least 150 minutes per week. So you can use that how you wish, space it out over the day, but important to also incorporate some exercise and activity. So in summary, with the dietary recommendations, so the overall principle is a very low-fat diet. It is the current treatment and management for FCS and trying to keep those levels down. It does, as I mentioned, vary from person to person, and it does depend on someone's triglyceride levels. It's important to ensure while you're on a very low-fat diet that you are getting a good source of essential fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins, so talking with your dietitian and your team about that. That you're including a lean or low-fat protein portion and also a carbohydrate portion with each meal, and if possible, looking at what are some of the more complex carbohydrate options that you enjoy in your day and that you feel you could cook and incorporate into recipes. MCT can be used, just needs to be increased gradually, and avoiding alcohol is the overall sort of recommendations for the diet. So now that we've talked through some of the principles of the diet, we're now going to move on to some more of the practical aspects. So how much fat is in that? And shopping and reading food labels can be a real minefield. There's a lot of information out there that can be confusing and misleading and very challenging. So I'm going to try and work through some of the steps of that. But again, welcome to ask questions at the end. So when it comes to foods, food labels are a great source of information. They can, as I say, can be incredibly complicated. I can get myself confused many times when looking at them, but in general, they should be on most packaged foods. They should always include the name of the food. So for example, this one is a chicken and vegetable broth. They should include the weight of the food. This one's 600 grams. They should include the ingredients, and the ingredients are always listed in order of quantity. So the first ingredient being the highest quantity in the food product, and the last ingredient being the smallest quantity in that food product. And they should include a nutrition information label. So at the bottom, we can see here on the screen, they've got nutrition, and they typically have energy, which is calories, fats, carbohydrates, fiber, protein, and then the amount of each of those nutrients in the food product. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the nutrition information panel, because that can be a real source of advice and guidance on how much fat is in a product. So fat content is mandatory on products, so it always will list fat, and it will always list nutrients per 100 grams. The foods can sometimes list nutrients per serve or per portion. They don't always. And if they do have a per serve and per portion, they will also have the number of serves that that product advises. So for example, this chicken and vegetable broth says that half a pot is a serve and that the product contains 2 portions. So there should be 2 serves in that packet of broth. Talking through the different types of nutrition labeling in terms of the nutrients per 100 grams and then the per serve. So we're going to start first with the nutrients per 100 grams. So the per 100 grams has important roles. One, it really helps to comparison between 2 foods. So if you're in a shopping aisle and you're looking at breakfast cereals, for example, you could pick up 2 breakfast cereals, and while one cereal might both have a serving recommendation or per serve, that's always determined by the manufacturer. So it could be different in each product, where if you're comparing the per gram, 100 grams, then you're comparing the same amount of that product, of each product, to look at how much fat is in that. So it helps to make comparisons between foods, to maybe start with the one that has the lowest fat option, and then from there you can use steps, which we'll talk through soon, to work out how much to weigh out of that product. So it can help to work out how much to weigh of a food to give you 1 gram of fat, or if you've already weighed out a portion of food to work out how much fat is in that serve. So the calculations, I put them up on the screen, and as Jill mentioned, this will be recorded today. So welcome to go back and have a look at these equations, or to take a photo of it, so you've got that to use again if you feel that it would be helpful. So the nutrients per 100 grams, the general how to work out how much fat is in, or how much to weigh for 1 gram of fat. So first you look at the fat content per 100 grams. This example here has 7.7 grams. And then you take 100, it's always 100, divided by the fat per 100 grams. And that gives you the weight of the food for 1 gram. So if you weighed out a portion of this food based on that calculation, so 100 divided by 7.7, for example, with this example here on the side, that would give you a weight that you would need to weigh, and that would give you 1 gram of fat. But you might not want to only eat 1 gram of fat. Maybe you've got 2, maybe you've got 3 grams, maybe you've got 5 grams of fat that you want from that particular food item. So you can then take that weight that you've worked out for 1 gram of fat and multiply it by the number of grams that you need or that you want from that food item. So for example, if you wanted to have 3 grams of fat, you would take the weight of the food times 3, and that would give you the total weight of the food. That would give you 3 grams of fat. And then you could use scales to weigh that out. The next slide is just an example of what I've gone through. So this on your, depends which way you're looking at it, but on your left, there's a nutrition information label for a cereal. Now it has got a per 30 gram serve of cereal, so you may want to just weigh out 30 grams and look at how much fat is in that. But you might also want to have a slightly different serve, or you might just want to work out how much of the cereal I need if I want to have 2 grams of fat, for example. So what the equation that you would use would be to take 100 divided by the fat per 100 grams, which in this case is 4.7 on the nutrition information label. So 100 divided by 4.7 equals 21 grams. So 21 grams of the cereal would give you 1 gram of fat. But if you wanted 2 grams of fat from this food, you would then take the weight of 21 grams, divide it by how many grams of fat you want in total, being 2, and that would give you the total weight of the cereal to result in having 2 grams of fat. So 21 times by 2 gives you 42 grams. So putting that on the scale, for example, putting your bowl on the scale, tearing the scale to 0 and weighing out 42 grams would mean that if you ate that 42 grams of cereal, that would provide 2 grams of fat. The other aspect of a nutrition information panel that can be helpful is if a product does have a per serve or per portion amount. So this advises how much fat you would have per serve or per portion if you ate the whole serving or portion that the product advises. Portions or servings aren't always specified, so they're not always a requirement on the label. And sometimes they can be mixed with other foods, which can make it really confusing. For example, they might have 30 grams of cereal with milk, and they might have the fat amount for that. But you might be using a very low-fat milk version, where maybe that manufacturer has used standard milk or full-fat milk. So it's sometimes hard then to work out from that fat amount how much of that is from the cereal and how much is that is from the milk. But if it doesn't have anything mixed with it, for example, the example I've got on the side here of a per biscuit. So this is an information label from some crackers. So one example per biscuit gives 0.3 grams of fat, and the other example per biscuit gives 1 gram of fat. So if you were to eat one of those biscuits, for example, on the top nutrition information panel, you would have 0.3 grams of fat, and if you had one biscuit from the bottom, you would have 1 gram of fat from that biscuit. So they can be really helpful when they are available, and especially if it's per biscuit, per slice, per packet. But what if I have weighed a portion that isn't the amount on the nutrition label? So this is another scenario that can happen. So it's not, I've put out a portion of food, for example, say someone has prepared some rice and you've weighed it out onto your plate, you know how much weight it is, but it isn't 30 grams, so we can't go per serve. So how much fat would be in that portion? So the calculation for this, and I know there's a lot of calculation here. This is the last one, but hopefully I am making sense as I'm talking through this, but also welcome to go back and listen through it again. There can also be some really helpful guides online for reading food labels as well. So with this example, so you've got a portion of food, how much fat is in that? So you take the per 100 grams, you look at how much fat per 100 grams. For example, the cereal, 4.7 grams. You divide it by 100, and then you times that by the weight of the food that you have in your bowl. And that will give you how much fat is in that portion that you've weighed out. So for example, with the cereal, if we work through this example, we've got 4.7 grams of fat per 100 grams from the nutrition information label. We divide that by 100. And then we times that by 35 grams, which is how much we've weighed in the bowl on the scales. And that tells us that 1.6 grams of fat is in that 35 gram portion. So if you were to eat that full bowl of cereal as it is, 1.6 grams of fat would come from that portion. So there's a lot of different maths, and labels can be very, very confusing. There isn't always a clear where is the fat and what is this coming from, serve or 100 grams, but there generally is always a per 100 grams. So that can be useful to at least work out how much food would give 1 gram of fat, or if I weighed this portion, how much fat is in this portion of food. There are, however, some cases where there's no nutrition information label, and that does happen. Say, for example, you're shopping at a market, or there are some fresh produce that don't always have nutrition labels. Maybe you're over at a good friend's and they've got a jar of cereal and you're trying to work out how much fat is in that. So these scenarios can be really challenging, but my recommendation is to refer to any resources that you have on low-fat options. So this may have come from your dietitian, or maybe has come, for example, from the LPLD Alliance website. They've got some good resources, the now Action FCS as of today. So using those guides can help see whether a food is known to be low in fat or actually does need to be factored in. Speaking with your dietitian, so we have lots of access to different databases online, or textbooks, or special nutrition information analysis packages, where we could maybe have a look and see how much fat is in a certain food, if it's something that you do enjoy and want to have regularly, to see how that would fit into your fat allowance. And also mobile phone apps can be helpful. So there is a few different apps out there where you could look at a portion of food, or a food that, say for example, a portion of rice, a banana, a sweet potato, and look at different portions and how much fat, carbohydrate might be coming from those. So those are useful resources. I mentioned just before about the dietary guidelines for FCS that are available on the Now Action FCS website. So these have been recently updated, and they do have good, really helpful guidance on what foods can be eaten, what are known to be lower in fat, and what ones are high in fat, and would definitely need to check the labels and nutrition analysis. Foods sometimes do change, and that's the other thing just to be, we do always recommend, is if there's a food that you are having on a regular basis, checking the label, working out how much of a portion to have is important, and then just keeping a little eye on it, because sometimes manufacturers like to add things or change things. So being aware of what that nutrition information is for the products that you're eating. And then once you've had worked out the different components of a diet and where fats might be coming from, say for example your portion of rice, your slice of bread, then it's about also putting it into recipes and making foods that you enjoy and that taste great. And there are a lot of great recipes available for very low fat cooking on the Action FCS website, which will launch soon. There are also recipes on the Heart UK website. So they have a FCS page around eating for FCS, and then very low fat diet recipes. Also those recipes guide on how much fat you would get from those recipes if you were to cook them. It can also be helpful to search online. So searching for fat-free or low-fat recipes. Now, there's sometimes the information out there can be a bit confusing. They don't always factor in total fat. So with FCS, your fat allowance is factoring all the fats that might come. So there might be what they call unsaturated fats, saturated fats, trans fats. The only one that wouldn't necessarily be factored into that is the MCT oil that we talked about. So sometimes you can find a recipe that says low fat, but they might still use, for example, avocado or a nut butter, which would be very high in fat and wouldn't be safe to use. So it is just about looking through on the recipe just to truly check that they are low in fat. And if it's not clear, linking in with your dietitian for advice on that. Tips around cooking without fat. So using and I'm sure you've got many great ideas, so I'd also love to hear from yourselves. Welcome to put those into the comments. We're always loving hearing what people are doing, learning new ideas. Your feedback and your thoughts and suggestions are always fantastic. Some of the things that we recommend, and having had conversations with those living with FCS, is to use non-stick pots and pans. So that avoids then the need for oil. So you can cook meats and fish and vegetables without having problems with sticking. Instead of using oils, you can also try with using small amounts of stock. So making up a little bit of stock, and while cooking and frying, say cooking off an onion or garlic, adding bits of stock to that just to help with cooking that and stopping it from sticking or burning. Just helps to caramelize the foods. Sometimes adding water throughout if sticking is a problem. Vinegars, lemon juice, soy sauce are options that can be used. And by, for example, adding lemon juice to a food and letting it really reduce and cook down, that can really help to intensify some of the flavors. Cooking methods such as steaming, boiling, poaching are all low fat options, or using a clean griddle pan can be really helpful, nice to finish and cook off meat. And MCT, as we discussed earlier, has a really low smoke point, so it isn't helpful for frying or using at the start of cooking, but it can be used after cooking, mixed through food or as a dressing. Tips for baking without fat. So again, to avoid the need to put butter or oil in a pan or in a cake dish, using silicone cookware can be helpful, as you can help to then just pop out the food after cooking, or using baking paper, so there's no need to grease when baking or cooking. And some of the substitutes, and there are a few recipes out there, and I've also seen some on the Action FCS website, is looking at substitutes for butter and oil. So quite often mashed banana, unsweetened applesauce, and squash are some of the things that are used as a substitute and actually work quite well in cooking. And MCT oil can be used, but again, for low heat baking, or if you're making a raw product where you're adding all the ingredients together that doesn't require cooking, MCT could be used as an option as a fat option. And then tips for adding flavour without fat. So whilst you're not cooking necessarily with fat, it's still very important for food to taste good, to have enjoyment in your cooking and eating. So using lots of fresh herbs and dried herbs, they're absolutely fine. Spices, spice mixes, great way to add flavour to food, don't affect the fat content. Using onion, garlic, chili, lemons, lime, vinegar are all other great ways of getting a lot of flavour into foods. and also using small amounts of soya sauce or miso paste or stocks can also be a good way. So those products do have a lot of salt in them, so good to use in moderation, but are a good way of adding in. You don't need a little can go a long way for adding some of the flavors to food. Now, I have included a slide on South Asian cuisine or cooking, as we do sometimes get quite a lot of questions about this, and it is a great cuisine with lots of flavor, lots of varieties and spices, but it can sometimes be high in fat if it's cooked with oil or finished with butter or ghee. So some of our recommendations around that is to definitely continue using a variety of spices, chilies, herbs, onions, garlic, tomato, ginger. So all those components that are important in the cooking won't be contributing any fat, so can be used really freely. Replacing oils and butters and ghee in the cooking. And that, for example, could be using small amounts of stock when starting off with the onions and garlic and the chili, just to stop it from sticking, but also just to help the flavors all group together. So adding just a small amount of stock or water at that point can be helpful. Using lean proteins, chickpeas, lentils, chicken breast, goat are all options that could be included in the cooking and would be really important as the source of protein for that meal, but tend to be lower in fat. Rice, important part of the meal for providing the carbohydrate portion. It is good to consider the portion on the plate, so to make sure that you've got your fist as a guide, or to aim for a third of your plate to be your rice, and also bread portion. So your breads and rice that might be part of that meal both factor into the carbohydrate portion. With breads, we recommend the chapati or roti, ones that use flour and water, and to avoid adding any oils in the cooking phase. So avoiding breads like the paratha, which have a lot more of might have oils or ghee as part of the making process. So to use those, the chapati and roti, dry fry them, and to not add the oil at the end. So just to keep that fat aspect out, but they can be then used as a good carbohydrate aspect to the diet. And then if you enjoy having the meal with yogurt, using a fat-free yogurt or quark could be another option, and that can be stirred in at the end if you're wanting a curry, for example, to be creamy, or to just have on the side. Again, they provide another source of protein and can be a low-fat option as well. And then eating out. So eating out is really challenging and really tricky. Menus don't always make it clear about what's low fat, and it sometimes can be unsure how foods might be cooked or prepared. Were they started in oil? Did they add butter at the end? So there's lots of really great tips, because eating out it's still a very important aspect. It's important for socializing. Eating is a center around a lot of events. So looking at the tips on the Action FCS and the Heart UK website can be really helpful. And some of the points that they have are around checking the menu online for suitable options. So planning, it does involve a little bit of planning in advance. So looking at the recipe, the restaurant online, they normally do provide a menu, or if not, ringing up and asking for it in advance. So you can just get familiar with the types of foods that are on the menu. Calling the restaurant ahead of time to discuss low-fat options can be really helpful. So talking with the chef and seeing how they could cater for that. And if needed, you could also check if you could in fact bring your own meal, if that's the case, if they are going to be tricky to find an option that is available. Don't feel that you can't ask about how a meal is prepared. So definitely feel welcomed, and so it is very important when you're at a restaurant to check with the staff and the chef. How is it prepared? Have they steamed, grilled, boiled it? What ingredients have they used? Have they started with any oils? Have they added any creamy sauces, any butter? Switching out your side dish. So a lot of times at a restaurant, a side dish may be fries or chips. So asking if you could switch that out for steamed vegetables or a salad with no dressing, or a plain jacket potato, so that you still get that carbohydrate side, but a low-fat alternative. And generally speaking, Japanese or Vietnamese cuisine tends to be low in fat. It's not always, but there are options. For example, sushi, the nori, the rice, low fat options. It's just thinking about what's in the sushi, whether they've used any mayonnaise, avocado, oily fish, but just checking that they are low fat options. And with Vietnamese, they might have the rice paper rolls that haven't been deep fried, so the fresh rice paper rolls, or the pho, the soup that they do. So those could be good starting points, but always good just to check with the chef whether they have added any oils or fats to that. And then monitoring fat index. I suppose closing up where we've talked around the dietary recommendations, then how to actually work out how to calculate fat in a food product, and then monitoring fat. So normally you will be working towards a fat allowance, so many grams of fat a day. And it is really important, and can be really important to keep a diary of that, because it can be easy to sort of lose track on what food was in that meal, how much fat was in that meal, snacks. So just having a routine of keeping a track of your fat intake can be helpful. Keeping a diary, some people find that helpful, writing down what you're having over the day, or keeping a little tally of your grams of fat that have come from different foods. Using mobile phones can be helpful, so mobile phone apps. No app is perfect. A lot of the apps are really focused around calories and weight as opposed to fat, but sometimes there are ones out there that you can change to setting a target for fat intake, so that can be helpful. Planning weekly meals in advance can be a helpful strategy as well. It does require planning and batch cooking, but if you've got your meals planned for the week, whether in the freezer, in the fridge, or in the fridge at work, can just be helpful to take that thinking out of every day of having to plan every meal, calculate and weighing. If you've planned it and you know exactly how much you're getting from each meal, that can be helpful. And you could calculate the total fat intake from a recipe, for example, if you're batch cooking and you're dividing it up into different portions, and then divide the amount of fat into the 5 portions, for example, of food, so that you know that after that meal, that's how much fat you've had from that portion. And lastly, we're just going to talk briefly about FCS and diabetes, and also FCS and hospital admissions. So diabetes can be an aspect of FCS. If there's repeat episodes of acute pancreatitis, there can be some damage to the pancreas, which can then lead to diabetes or insulin insufficiency. And that provides a real balancing act between fat and carbohydrates. So we've talked a lot about the fat and keeping a monitoring of that and aiming for your fat allowance each day. But with diabetes, carbohydrates come into it even more. So we do recommend linking in with your diabetes team to optimize any medication that you might be on. And working with your dietitian, or looking through recipes or food ideas that maybe use a bit more of the higher fiber or more complex carbohydrates, as they do have that slower release of glucose into the body, so they can sustain or provide fuel for a longer period of time, and they can also prevent some of the spikes or increases in blood sugars that sometimes can occur with diabetes. Your portion of carbohydrates is really important. So always to include a portion of carbohydrates at each meal, but might be more aiming to around the sort of fist-sized portion of the plate. And lean proteins are really important part of the meal. So they're really important in general, but with diabetes, they become a really important source of providing fuel if you are keeping carbohydrates down to more the fist portion size. Healthy weight is important. So again, linking in with your diabetes team and dietitian to support with that. Keeping active, out and about, aiming for that 150 minutes a day is really important. And it's important too to link your, if you're happy, to link your FCS and your diabetes team so that they can all work together to support you. In terms of hospital admission, so this is mainly around catering. And again, this can be a challenging time. Presenting to hospital, the menu that you might be offered to choose from might not have many or easy accessible low-fat options. So what are some of the things or tips that I've got around that? If you've got a planned admission, so you know you're going to hospital, you've got a time, a date booked in, it's important to let your FCS team know and your dietitian. Your dietitian can then contact the local hospital dietitian in advance to discuss what might be appropriate options to offer to you on the menu, what catering options they can offer, so that you do have varieties, because it's important for you to be well fueled, have good options for breakfast, lunch and evening meal. I would recommend packing some low-fat snacks, just so you've got options to snack on between meals. And also to always take a copy of your recent clinic letter and any diet sheets that you might have that would be helpful for the staff to see. But sometimes admissions, or most of the time, they can be unplanned. So what do you do if you have an unplanned admission? If you have come in with pancreatitis, you may be required to fast for a period of time. But it's important to let your medical team or your nursing team know that you have FCS and request an urgent referral to the dietitian, and for them to outline the referral that you do have FCS and requiring a specialized diet, so the dietitian can prioritize the referrals that are coming through and see you and offer that support. Also notify your dietitian once you are in hospital, because they again can link in with the local dietitian and just offer guidance and support around options. There might be a low-fat catering option available, so it's always good to check. There is a case in the hospital where if there has been, so it's called a chyle leak diet, where someone has had some sort of damage to their lymphatic system, either in their neck or if they've had neck or chest surgery. That can be a complication that can sometimes occur. And for those patients who have a chyle leak, the management is a very low fat diet, generally less than sort of 10 grams a day. So it could be, whilst this isn't FCS and completely aligned with the diet, it could be a good starting point as an urgent point or diet catering option until your dietitian can look through other options that are available. So it might be worth checking if that is available. So that's an overall low fat diet and does include some MCT. And that is the end of my presentation. I realize that you've been hearing me speak now for some time, so I hope that you got to take away at least one thing from that presentation. I hope that is helpful. I will hand it back to Jill now. I'm happy to answer any questions that have come through. And if there are any questions that come up after this talk, welcome to let Jill know, and we can try and see if I could link in or offer those. So if we don't have time to get through your questions, I can try and see if I can address them at a later date. Thank you.
So thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant, very comprehensive and very detailed. So I want to really thank you for that. I'll just look at the chat to see, we have some questions here. So we have a question: do you monitor fat-soluble vitamins annually, and how specifically do you monitor vitamin K? Is it via clotting or specifically measuring vitamin K? That was one question.
So, so we do monitor them annually, the fat-soluble vitamins. The vitamin K is can be a challenging one. So we do a test called the PIVCA, and we do vitamin K as well. So that's how we tend to monitor those.
Okay, and sorry, that's yeah. So the second question is there a reputable website that does all your calculations? That's a good question. Is that available to patients? Is another.
Yeah. So I So the British Dietetic Association, the BDA, does have a resource on food labels and what to look at in the food labels. In terms of the calculations, the different options that I've given there with using the different boxes to insert the numbers, I'm not 100% sure, but we would be more than happy to develop a resource or so put this information into a sheet that we could share with Action FCS that can be available.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. So we have a comment here that I was always encouraged to include oily fish such as mackerel in my diet as they're a good source of essential fatty acids. Is this still recommended?
That's a really good question. So mackerel is an oily fish, and probably it depends really on how strict your fat allowance is and what your triglyceride levels are. So we tend to find that most people, that mackerel wouldn't, due to the fat content, would be a bit high to fit in some of the fat allowances. It is definitely a source of essential fatty acids, completely correct. And if it fitted in within your allowance, then it could be a source. But if not, we tend to look at trying to meet essential fatty acids through using more of the whole grains, and then monitoring and factoring in to see if a small amount of some oils might be useful, but they always do have to then factor into the overall fat intake, which can be challenging. And it's definitely, we're doing more work in this area to understand the roles of them.
Okay, thank you. So there's a comment here about MCT oil, which is that it's useful, but it really does depend on where you live. This patient's saying in Bristol it was prescribed, but in Luton it's classed as a food and not available. And so how can you, as a patient, encourage your consultants to prescribe it to you as an essential kind of dietary kind of support?
Yeah. It's a real shame that it's not available all over. And I think that what maybe would be helpful is to link in with your dietitian. Maybe they could write a letter of support to the GP, just explain the role of it and its importance. I don't know what purpose it was used for, whether it was for increasing calories, if weight was a problem, for growth, or just to be able to provide that fat that can be then added through cooking as a dressing at the end of cooking. So I think we do that we quite often might write through to the GP and just really give a good clear rationale as to why it's important, and hope that they would then be able to offer that. So it is a product that is available on prescription, but I do know that different CCGs are funded differently and may or may not. So that would be my first recommendation, would be to go to your dietitian or treating team and see if they could offer a letter of support.
So there's a question that comes there about not all of us are under a dietitian. So how do we get ourselves to be seen by a dietitian if we aren't? And how do we get a dietitian who understands FCS? Because quite a lot of patients have had quite poor experiences with dietitians who've done their best but just haven't understood the condition. I mean, that may have changed now, but that has been history for some people.
Yeah. So I think it would be really useful to be under dietitian. It's a diet that is very, very strict, and I think it really does need the support of a dietitian, just to make sure that it's nutritionally balanced and really help out with any of the scenarios that you might be finding challenging. I would talk to your GP to see if there is a inherited metabolic service available in the country or the area that you could link in with, and if not, and also the other option is through lipid services, to see if they have a service that has a dietitian linked in with them as well.
Thank you. So somebody's asking, what exactly is MCT? Is it an actual product?
So MCT is the two fats. It's called C8 and C10. So there are two types of fatty acids that are absorbed via the portal veins, or different veins of the liver, so they use a different type of metabolism, and they're normally fats that convert to a product that's called ketones, which are available for the brain. So they yeah, they are. The true MCT is just the C8 and the C10, but sometimes you might see another fat aspect to that, and that's where, say, for example, the coconut comes in. Coconut oil might be classified, they might say it's MCT, but it does also have some of the other components, other fats to it that wouldn't be absorbed in the chylomicron, bypassing the chylomicron dependent pathway, so they can affect triglycerides. So it's really important to make sure it is that pure source.
Thank you. So regarding exercise, someone's saying it's 150 minutes a week. What level exertion is recommended? A brisk walk, a jog, or a slow leisurely paced walk count as exercise?
Yeah, really good question. So the recommendation is to do some resistance as well as some cardio. And I think it's always key to get the heart rate up. That's always the most important part. So everyone's tolerance will be slightly different. So for some, that might be walking some stairs and doing a bit of, walk around the park might get the heart rate up. Others might require a little bit more, a light jog. So it's really about building on your fitness. Exercise is helpful for overall health, keeping heart healthy, body healthy, muscles. So I suppose always trying to see if you could challenge yourself a little bit more would be beneficial, but it is good to include both a bit of resistance, which is the weights, whether that's using actual weights or using bands, and also doing a bit of cardio to get the heart rate up as well.
Okay, brilliant. And it's also about thinking about exercise differently. So actually kind of not necessarily having to go to a gym, but just thinking about kind of taking an extra walk to a bus stop at a brisk pace also equals exercise, and it can be seen as relatively painless.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that's so important. That's such a good point, Jill. It doesn't need to be going to the gym. It is about getting out of the park. It might be deciding to take the stairs rather than the lift at work. All those aspects do count.
Someone's saying, I have to take enzymes now because my pancreas is damaged. Can that have effect on triglycerides?
So that's a really good question. So certainly that is correct that if the pancreas is, pancreas does have a role in providing digestive enzymes. And so if it has been damaged, some do need to take that. So taking those enzymes will be really important because without them, there will be some malabsorption. So not all nutrients will be well absorbed. So it is really important to take those. The impact on triglycerides, I actually don't know the answer to that, sorry. I'll have to come back to you on that one, but they are definitely can be taking pancreatic enzyme replacement can be a case for FCS if the pancreas is damaged, and that they are important because without that, then certainly the fats, soluble vitamins, essential fatty acids, and the nutrition that you are getting from the diet wouldn't be well absorbed. So they do play an important role.
So we have a patient here saying, I've got GPA vasculitis, ANCA positive. I'm on a high dose of steroids. Both FCS and GPA are affecting each other, and my hunger is ridiculous. I've never been under a dietitian. So do you have any kind of advice about how to kind of combat extreme hunger?
Yeah, that would be a challenge. That's a challenging thing to balance, so definitely. And I think that getting under a dietitian if you can would be really great. I would recommend having a really to have a look at some of the proteins that we talked about today, because proteins are really helpful for that satiety. So maybe looking at whether you could get a good sort of hand portion of protein into your fat allowance. Again, I don't know what your fat allowance is for the day, but trying to really focus on having low fat protein options in the house, whether it's fat-free cottage cheese, fat-free quark, having legumes as added into the meals, having canned tuna and brine, so that you've got those options to snack on, because that's probably the next, after fats, that's probably the next macronutrient that can really help with that feeling of full and creating satiety.
Okay. So another question, do we need to take omega-3 as a supplement, as we're not allowed any oily fish? So
omega-3, you can get some of it from other sources. So omega-3 converts down to longer chain fats, and those longer chain fats are ones that can come directly from fish. But you're completely right, if you're not having fish, you won't get those direct sources, but it is important then to have the dietary source of omega-3. So those could come from a little bit of oils that might be part of the diet. They might also come from some of the green leafy vegetables. So again, important for someone to monitor that. There are certain times where, so during pregnancy, during lactation, where getting a source of those longer chain fats that you would normally get from fish is very important, and fish probably won't feature, oily fish wouldn't feature in the diet during that time. So then it might be that it needs to be supplemented as well, the direct source of those longer chain fats, and supported by your team as well to make sure that those are met. So they are definitely those critical times, pregnancy and also childhood growth and development.
And how would you, I mean, would you get, omega from Omicol or Maxipo, as it used to be called?
Yes.
That would come. And does that actually have a fat content to it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So some people may be on Omicol. That is actually a really high dose of omega-3. So if you are on that, you are getting a source of omega-3, and its purpose is as a way of reducing triglycerides. So it's in very high sort of pharmacological high levels. But that will provide a source of omega-3. The evidence for that in bringing down triglycerides can be quite inconsistent. But if you are on that will be providing omega-3. It is quite high, so it tends to be around 4 grams that you might be on a day, and that is a fat. So that should really be factored into your fat allowance.
Okay.
So whenever you are taking those high dose, if you then start on a high dose omega-3, such as Omicol, that will need to be factored in. But I would recommend just working with your team to monitor your triglycerides, because it may be that starting that high dose might influence your triglycerides as well. So it'll need to be a combination of diet, fat allowance, and the omega-3, and balancing that. So maybe more regular triglycerides during that time could be helpful.
I mean, you may not know the answer to this, but I've always wondered how much a Omicol capsule was in terms of fat, because if you're on 4 a day, is that 4 grams of fat a day? It's hard to know really, because it doesn't give you a nutritional analysis.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think the 1 gram, the tablet is 1,000 milligrams of the longer chain fats. So that would translate to 1 gram of fat. Right. But again, it would how that then affects the diet would need to be determined on triglycerides, because it may not have as a direct effect as maybe 1 gram of dietary fat.
Right. So just in terms of that, so how do we access more testing for triglycerides? Because are there any home testing solutions that you're aware of that are on the horizon? Maybe a bit like diabetes. I know there is one, but it only goes up to about 5 grams, and so for a lot of us, that's sort of quite meaningless, really.
Yes. I'm not actually personally aware of any of the home testing. That would certainly be very helpful to have that. So at the moment, we do tests when someone comes to clinic, or at the moment with the current situation, linking in with the GP. But I think that more regular testing could be helpful to help really work with your dietitian and your team to optimize and support with the diet. So I think that's something that we just need to, we will certainly be looking into and how we can improve that. But unfortunately, there's no home test at the moment that I'm aware of anyway.
Right. And so, I mean, it sounded like asking your GP to help you to monitor is an option, really, and that the consultants could support you in that request if there's any problem with it.
Absolutely. And the GP, it's certainly a test the GP can order quite easily. It could be done in the community, and then that you could just send that result through to your team once you got that.
Right. So, question, can a disciplined diet eradicate the condition over time and reduce or eliminate the need for medications such as atorvastatin and fenofibrates?
So the diet, so the condition, the diet itself wouldn't eliminate the condition, so you would always have FCS, but it certainly can support to bring the triglyceride levels down. Now, there are some cases that no matter how hard someone tries with the diet, the levels are really challenging to manage with triglycerides, so medications may still be needed. But certainly the diet plays a big role, and so effort putting in that aspect and finding a diet that works well for you, that you feel gives you enough variety, and it was within a fat allowance to keep the triglyceride down as low as possible is very important and a huge component to it. But it may never completely eliminate the need for medications. But certainly without the diet, you'd be at great risk of all the complications, which are obviously can much affect quality of life.
Thank you. So you might be relieved to know that that was the last question. So, and actually I see we've got about 5 minutes to go. So if anyone has a last minute question they want to quickly add to the chat box. So we've got somebody saying, I've got an AccuRead home monitor, but it only goes up to 8 millimole.
Okay.
So if anyone is lucky enough to be down that low and wanting to monitor, that sounds like an option. So yeah. So okay, so what I've missed out from these questions are the thank you very much that people have been saying, and really helpful and really good information. So I will echo that sort of very much, actually. That's been really helpful and really informative, and hopefully if anyone's got any questions that pop up after this, they can sort of feed them through to me and I can feed them through to you at some point.
Absolutely.
So yeah. So Sarah, that's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you very, very much for your time this evening. You've been most appreciated. So I'm going to draw the meeting to an end now. We've got thanks so much, Sarah and Jill. Thank you. Thank you very much, very useful. Lots and lots of thank yous coming through. So I won't keep you with just saying thank you endlessly, but so just be aware that everyone is very grateful to this. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I hope it was useful, and yeah, more than happy to answer questions that come through later. And I'll send send through the information on the food labelling if that would be of help as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So I shall finish the recording now, and then what I'll do is I'll send it through to everybody, and we'll also be putting it on our new website, which is going to be available soon, as Action FCS, as I've neglected to say. So I'm going to finish the meeting now and say thank you ever so much for everyone who's joined us, and we hope to see you again soon. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.